So hi, welcome to the talk that I'm going to give on the book that was just released at the end of January by Platypus Publishing. It's the second book that we've published. It's a book that collects articles originally published in the Platypus Review, which is the monthly paper of the Platypus Affiliated Society. What we wanted to do with this book was collect all of the articles that we had published around the election and about Trump in particular, and just have it all be in one place and kind of curate it to make sense of the last 2 years of history. You'll notice that the cover is we found a wonderful photo of Trump Tower in Chicago when it was still under construction back in 2008, which is a nice kind of way of marking time, because 2008 is when Obama was elected, and it was also early years for Platypus as an organization. I think that we were largely still based in Chicago at that time. Let's pull up the table of contents for the book in particular and talk about the selection of articles and why I selected them as the editor of the book, but also get into why I wrote the articles that I did that are included in the book. Starting at the end of 2015, during the primary campaign season, a couple of things became evident. So the first article in the book is on the Sandinistas, and it's about the Bernie Sanders candidacy. But really it's about the entire primary campaign season and about the two surprise phenomena of the 2016 election cycle, namely Sanders and Trump. So part of the goal that I had from the very first article that I wrote on the election was to anticipate specifically how the left might regard these phenomena, how the left was going to perceive the election, and think about the historical background for that perception. In other words, what was the history that was informing the way people were responding. My own assumption was that Hillary Clinton would be nominated by the Democrats and elected as president pretty much unopposed. In other words, certainly not opposed by anyone in the Democratic Party, but also not really facing a serious opposition from the Republicans, meaning of course the Republicans would put up someone and try their best to get elected. But I saw Hillary Clinton prevailing. So I was surprised, first of all, by Bernie Sanders announcing his candidacy at all, because I knew of Bernie Sanders going back to when I was in college in Western Massachusetts, and he was first mayor and then a congressman, and then finally a senator from Vermont. And so I knew him as an old former New Leftist, as a socialist, but not as someone that I took to be particularly radical or particularly effective as a politician. In other words, I saw him as someone who would get up in Congress and make speeches that no one listened to. And what was remarkable for me was that the rhetoric of his campaign, the speeches that he gave in his campaign, starting in 2015, sounded exactly like the speeches he would get up and give in Congress. And so he was the same as he had been back in the 80s when I was in college. Also, I should say that Donald Trump was the same. I'm from New York originally, and so I'm familiar with Donald Trump as a personality from New York City. And he was also the same, right? And if you had asked me a year before he announced his candidacy, I would have said, oh yeah, that would just be some, media circus, like not really going anywhere. So I would have thought that both in the case of Bernie Sanders and in the case of Donald Trump, that they were very unlikely challengers in any respect. But when they announced, in other words, when Bernie announced, I was a little bit more skeptical. When Trump announced, When he went down the golden escalator at Trump Tower in New York, I watched the the press conference where he announced his candidacy. I was immediately struck by the thought he could win. He could get the nomination and he could win. He could defeat Hillary in a way that maybe no one else could. I was suddenly struck by that. And not in a particularly fearful way, in a more kind of amused way, which is thinking about the man who I had been familiar with for a long time and the moment, right? And so the moment turned out to be a little bit different than I anticipated. In other words, I anticipated more of a kind of extension of the Obama era rather than a change. But once Sanders and Trump announced their candidacies, I thought, oh, in fact, there might be a possibility for change that I didn't otherwise predict. But again, I was concerned with what response and what effect this would have primarily on the left, meaning on the far left, not on the left in the colloquial sense of the Democrats being called the left, but rather the far left or the hard left, the Marxist left, the anarchist left, the socialist left. Thinking, okay, how would they respond to this? So I set myself the task, because we had already been doing Platypus for about 10 years. Not quite 10 years yet, but almost 10 years, when the election cycle began. And I thought about, okay, I knew through Platypus the culture of the left among young people today. I familiarized myself with that kind of generational sensibility, which I'll talk about in a moment with the millennial left. And I thought, okay, what is it that people need to know about what might happen? Meaning, if Trump were to be elected, what do people need to know about what that might mean? And I'm just old enough to have experienced a couple of things. One is the Reagan era. Although I was very young and not really cognizant, but I was cognizant in the aftermath of Reagan's election in 1980 of the shock effect that it had on the left. I encountered that as a teenager, as a young activist, dealing with older leftists, how they were still reeling, that they couldn't believe that this hyper-Cold War Hollywood actor was president of the United States. They still couldn't believe it, like 7 years in. They just couldn't believe it. I thought, okay, well, I set myself the task of preparing people and preparing students, preparing younger people, thinking about, okay, what are younger people on the left? What I was also thinking about my academic students, because I teach at the Art Institute, a kind of lefty kind of school, and I also teach at the University of Chicago, which isn't as lefty, but is kind of liberalish and might also be, in its own sense, considered left-wing, at least in the environments that I teach. What do people need to know about this phenomenon, right? What are they going to have to wrap their minds around? And it really had to do with the question of historical change. Historical change and how that registers in politics, and how confusing it can be when change comes from the right. In other words, where you have the left calling for change for many years. You had the anti-war movement when Platypus started out. You had Occupy Wall Street right before Obama's re-election in 2012, which, by the way, evidently it was Obama's re-election in 2012 that put the idea in both Bernie Sanders' head and Donald Trump's head to run for president in 2016, to protest against the direction they thought things were going in with Obama's re-election in the second term in particular. Mm-hmm. That the status quo was going to be shaken, and that change was going to come from an unlikely place, namely from the right, and the effect that that would have on the left. In other words, the kind of radicalism that had taken place in the prior 8 to 10 years, from about 2006, 2008, up to 2016, that a generation had been politicized and in certain respects radicalized, and how that was going to be dealt a very terrible blow by Trump's election. So I was anticipating, I was thinking ahead, and I thought, well, if Hillary is in the end elected, then in fact, there won't be this task of having to deal with the confusion and the shock. And so I don't really have to prepare for that so much. But what I do have to prepare for is what I thought might happen, but of course I could have been wrong. I thought it was likely, not guaranteed, that Trump would win. And to sort of lay the groundwork to start writing articles about that, and to get into that. So that's, starting from the first article in Sandinistas, that was the task. Then there were a couple of articles that were submitted to the Platypus Review for publication by a Russian Marxist, Boris Kagarlitsky, who kind of came out of the woodwork. Someone that I had met in college. He had come to speak as a kind of visiting academic faculty, and had told me when I was in college, this is around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, had said, Marxism is just an ideology of industrialization for backward countries, and so don't pay any attention to Marxism. But within a few short years, he rediscovered Marxism himself and became this kind of like, with a bee in his bonnet kind of Marxist, kind of on a mission, and a little bit cranky, but nonetheless. And so he wrote an article on Trump, Who's Afraid of Donald Trump, and then an article on Sanders, The Paralysis of Will, around the time of the Democratic National Convention, in which Hillary was officially nominated. And also raising, from a slightly different perspective, the question of, okay, how are people responding to these phenomena? How are people responding to Trump? And generally speaking, we had a very similar response, which is to say that it was causing the left to turn right. In other words, it was causing the left to de-radicalize, to become more conservative, to essentially want the Democrats to stop Trump. Right? So all the criticism of the Democrats that had gone on under Obama disappeared. Another phenomenon, which I'll get to in a little while, was the question of neoliberalism, meaning that the left had defined itself for so long, really in my entire lifetime, starting in the 90s certainly, and all the way up to the present, defining itself as anti-neoliberal, and that now suddenly the left was going to defend neoliberalism against the threat of fascism and what have you. So now that I've broached that word fascism, I'll talk about the provenance of that for a moment. So I mentioned the Reagan election and how this was a model in my mind for the kind of shock that the Trump election would have, which is to say that Reagan was also called a fascist. He was also called a candidate who was supported by the Ku Klux Klan, by the white supremacists. I guess they didn't really have the term white nationalist so much running in the discourse in 1980, but he was seen in those terms. And of course, going back a little bit further, Nixon, his election in 1968, after all the radicalism of the 60s and the civil rights movement and the Vietnam anti-war movement, he was also regarded as a fascist. And without this being the case, in other words, Nixon was not a fascist and Reagan was not a fascist, and of course I don't think Trump is a fascist either. So that was the first thing. In other words, to stop fascism would be the way in which the left would become supporters of the Democrats, because the Democrats would be seen as this bulwark against fascism. And neoliberalism would also change in value, meaning that the criticism of neoliberalism from the left would disappear in favor of defending neoliberalism from being attacked from the right. Right, so neoliberalism went from being this right-wing conspiracy into being the status quo that we have to defend against worse. Right, that kind of move. So coming around to the actual election, in the fall of 2016, being that Platypus is a student organization with chapters all around the country, all around the world, the beginning of the new academic year, we do a lot of promotion, we do tabling, at student activities fairs, etc. So I was solicited by the organization, by various organizers in Platypus. Oh, are you going to have a short article that we can hand out as a flyer at our tables in the beginning of the new academic year in September? Right, so I was asked this in August. And I said, okay, let's do this. And I wrote a short article, Why Not Trump? Why Not Trump? And playing on the rhetoric there. In other words, usually colloquially, what people mean by why not something is to say, yes, we want that. But I was playing with that rhetoric to actually mean it more literally, which is, why not? In other words, how is this imagined? What is the argument against it? Against Trump being elected president. Why not? What's the actual argument? Is the argument just to preserve the status quo? Is the argument just to preserve the status quo against worse? Right? Is that the argument? And so I wrote that, and that got a fair amount of attention and controversy. That was the sort of controversial article in the book, in the selections in the book. This is the kind of center of the controversy. But it's a very short piece. And it's about the question of lying and mendacity, the difference between lying and mendacity. And so the question of Trump as a liar versus the question of the status quo as mendacious. The status quo as sort of trafficking in a certain level of dishonesty. And, what we now, the rhetoric around, fake news, all this kind of stuff that you hear now in the discourse. And in terms of political rhetoric, political language, political discourse, and the question of lies and truth in politics. And so that was really the center of it, meaning, is the argument against Trump based on a misrepresentation, based on a need to lie about him, to exaggerate the threat? And again, that's when I kind of went back to my earlier experience, having grown up in New York and dealing with Trump as a figure, and thinking about, okay, well, what is Trump actually? Going all the way back. I think that I mentioned that just like Bernie Sanders had been saying the same thing since the 80s, Trump has been saying the same thing since the 80s. And what he did, actually, was he supported Michael Dukakis's candidacy for presidency in 1988. He even said that Jesse Jackson's candidacy, he ran in the primaries for president for the Democrats in 1984 and 1988. So Trump praised both Michael Dukakis and Jesse Jackson. And he was asked, are you going to get into politics? And he said, well, I would only get into politics to run for president, but I don't need to run for president because, look, we have these great people running for president, and so they're doing a good enough job. And I would only get involved if things got really bad. Mm-hmm. So that's about Michael Dukakis and Jesse Jackson, even. But I also knew him from a little bit later, after that election, the Central Park jogger case in New York City. And he came out, like the mayor of New York, Ed Koch, who was a Democrat, with this kind of blood-curdling, like, lynch mob justice kind of attitude towards the kids who were accused of the crime, who it turned out, of course, were not guilty and who were railroaded. And so I knew him in that guise too, and so I knew that he was what to my mind would be a conservative and a kind of right-wing figure in a certain sense. But in a certain sense, meaning like Ed Koch, the mayor of New York, a law and order conservative. In other words, a kind of strident, like just take them out and shoot them. Like they're guilty, just, like we don't need a trial, like this harsh law and order attitude. Which of course I find really horrifying, but is also a specific kind of right-wing politics. So it's a very specific kind of conservatism, different from Christian fundamentalism, different from a kind of hawkish, like foreign policy neoconservatism, and different also from neoliberalism, like a kind of free marketeering, and also different from the Tea Party, from the kind of, it shades into libertarianism, but this weird, like, constitutional conservatism, this kind of strict constructionist kind of notion, like the weird, like, Ted Cruz, kind of Tea Partyism. It's not any of those things, which we had become accustomed to seeing the right in those faces, like the different faces of the right: the Christian fundamentalist right, the neocon right, the neoliberal right, the libertarian right, the crazy constitutional kind of nerdy right, the kind of weird legalistic, Paul Ryan, Ted Cruz type people, and that Trump was a different kind of right, but also on the moderate side of the right. In other words, even then, essentially a right-wing Democrat, right? What Ed Koch was as mayor of New York, a right-wing Democrat, a conservative Democrat, a moderate Democrat, in the same way that the Clintons are, in the same way that Bill Clinton was and Hillary Clinton is, in fact. With slightly different rhetoric, of course, and different emphases, but nonetheless. And, Trump had signaled this during the campaign a few different ways. He had said, look, I'm running for the nomination of the Republican Party. If I was running for the nomination of the Democratic Party, I would put things a little bit differently. Right? And so, look, I gotta win over these people, and that's why I gotta say what I'm saying in the way that I'm saying it. But his positions on things were the same, like for almost 30 years. The one issue that was a little bit different, which is of course extremely important, is on immigration. In other words, he didn't say anything about immigration until this campaign, and that was he decided to take it up as his signature issue because he saw the candidates that he had to defeat, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, as weak on the issue. In other words, that he chose strategically to attack that issue in order to outflank his most likely, the most likely successful opponents in the Republican Party, members of the so-called Gang of Eight, who had proposed immigration reform but had failed under Obama. And that he was just going to take a kind of the same position on immigration that, in fact, George W. Bush had, and Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio, and even Obama himself had. In other words, this immigration reform that they've been floating since 2006, but not acting on, that he was going to couch it in more strident rhetoric, but advance the same policy. In other words, what he was saying is, politicians have been talking about this issue, but I'm going to get it done. Right, so exactly the same policy, which is of course horrible policy. It's so-called border security. It's also setting up a super exploited guest worker, kind of second-class citizen, like kind of making it official as opposed to having it be part of the black market in labor. To sort of officially say, we're going to pay people less, above board, and we're going to deny them. Little known fact, the Obama healthcare reform was geared, of course, because the healthcare crisis. What's the healthcare crisis? It's a crisis of the budget, the federal budget. So one of the things that Obamacare did was exclude immigrants from Medicaid. Right. So this was part of like, okay, we're gonna solve the healthcare problem, by which they don't mean make people more healthy. What they mean is spend less money, have the federal government spend less money. And one of the ways in which they did that is to say, we're going to make it harder or impossible for illegal immigrants to show up at the hospital and get the health care. So I wanted to sort of disenchant the hysteria around the Trump candidacy and to say there's going to be a lot of continuity here, and so specify the change that is going to happen. What's the change, in fact? Because there is a change, but there's also continuity, meaning a lot of what's going on with Trump, actually the groundwork for it was laid by the Obama presidency. And so even though Trump himself will talk about 15 or 16 or 17 years of failed policies, he'll talk about the two Bush terms, George W. Bush, and he'll talk about the Obama terms in one big sweep, about 16, 17 years of failed policies, failed politics. But what he means by that is that they've promised but not delivered, and so I'm going to actually deliver on what they promised, which is a peculiar kind of phenomenon. In other words, where he's like, we need to change to just do what we said we're going to do anyway, right? And of course, he had to appeal to the right-wing base of the Republican Party to win in the primaries, and he had to flip Democratic states to win the election, which of course he did do. And of course, this has been very confusing, and because it's confusing, it's been scary, and has elicited a kind of hysteria in response. That's precisely those things that we're confused about that seem more frightening, actually. But that confusion is less about Trump than it is about society and politics. And again, I was choosing my focus to be the left's particular confusion, because actually a lot of people are confused about it, meaning right-wing people are confused about it too, but I don't care about them. What I care about is what is the left's confusion about this. How do they try to make sense of it, but also how are they impaired in making sense of it? So a couple of other articles in there on this point. So Zizek, as it turned out, came out and said that he would vote for Trump if he were an American voting in the 2016 election. By which he meant, as a protest vote against the status quo. He said that before the election. And then had a slightly different attitude after the election, meaning because Trump was in fact elected, and Zizek said, well, of course Trump is horrible, yada, yada, yada. But anyway, it was enough for him to have said, if I were American and I were voting in this election, I would vote for Trump as a protest against the status quo, as a protest against the neoliberal status quo, to cause some controversy around him. And so we had an article written by Leonie Edinger about this phenomenon, sort of tracking the controversy around Zizek that we published in the volume. And we also took up, in a couple of different iterations, the question of authoritarianism in politics. So I wrote an article on Adorno and authoritarianism and what a dialectical approach to authoritarianism might mean. In other words, not to simply use the term as a pejorative, but rather think about it as an expression of contradiction, meaning that if you have political authoritarianism as a phenomenon, that it might be contradictory, and precisely through those contradictions point beyond itself, right? But we don't, not to be just anti-authoritarian. So the point that I make there is to denounce something is also a way of affirming it. That if you denounce something, you're kind of accepting it as an unchangeable reality. Right, so it's not enough to denounce something, you have to think about how it can be changed. And how it can be changed, how from within itself it can be changed. Because of course authoritarianism is not simply a matter of the right. The left also has a lot of authoritarianism. And indeed in the election, authoritarianism was not only manifest in the Trump campaign, but also in the Hillary campaign. And indeed in the Sanders campaign, in its own way. It was there too. And we had a contribution to the Platypus Review from Greece by Nikos Maliaris on Christopher Lasch, is an American cultural critic in the 60s and 70s, really well known in the 70s and 80s, who was a critic of the New Left from a leftist perspective, and dealt with the question of progress, like what do we understand by political progress? And also discontents with progress, with progressivism, because as you know, the 60s were ruled by the Democrats, meaning it was JFK and LBJ, it was the Great Society, it was the moment of the Civil Rights Movement, and attempting to sort of take discontents in society and channel them into progressive policy framework. And the New Left actually reacted to that. In other words, the New Left was concerned with not only the inadequacies of that, but also the problems of it, meaning that it was a sort of anti-LBJism. It wasn't just LBJ is not good enough. It was, this is actually taking us in another direction that we don't want to go in. Nikos Meliaris takes that up in the present moment. In other words, what does it mean to be discontented with progress and with progressivism, the discontents under Obama, Occupy Wall Street, but also the discontents that can manifest not only on the left but also on the right, and how do we make sense of that? In other words, Christopher Lasch was someone who, in a sense, predicted Reagan, saw the same kind of discontent that drove the New Left actually driving the New Right, that there was an affinity between the New Left and the New Right, and that it was most likely going to result in a right-wing outcome, manifestation, that discontent would ultimately resolve in a right-wing direction. So he revisits that to think about parallels with present history, in other words, change coming from the right or discontents being captured on the right. And then the two longest articles in the book are transcriptions of public fora that we had in Platypus, one in Vienna, The Crisis of Neoliberalism, and one in Chicago, Marxism in the Age of Trump. And in the Vienna discussion in which I participated, Boris Kagarlitsky came from Russia, and we had a kind of hardcore leftist, a Trotskyist, Emmanuel Tomaselli, and we also had the former finance minister of Syriza of the government in Greece, John Milios, who's a Marxist, and talked about how we understand neoliberalism itself coming into crisis, meaning starting in 2008 and then manifesting around the election, and manifesting not only by Trump's election but also by other things like Brexit, and by indeed Syriza being elected in Greece. Right, so it has a multifarious aspect. Then in Chicago, a few months later, we had a panel down at the University of Chicago that I participated in, titled Marxism in the Age of Trump, from which the book gets its title, with Catherine Liu, who, like me, is an academic. She teaches out in California, and she has a Frankfurt School background, but is critical of anti-neoliberalism in a way that I am as well. And Greg Lucero, who's a local activist in Chicago, a kind of militant left-wing activist from a Maoist background, to talk about, okay, so what do Marxists have to say, ultimately, about Trump, and coming at it from different directions. And what was interesting was that Greg actually invoked a lot of what I would take to be non-Marxism, meaning he invoked a lot of Lacanian psychoanalysis, he invoked a lot of other stuff. And Catherine Liu and I were like, because we're the same generation, we were like, oh, the kids have been miseducated, right? In this post-structuralist stuff, and actually it's kind of right-wing and depoliticizing. Catherine Liu, she is also, she's not only an academic, but she's also in the DSA, in the Democratic Socialists of America. I don't know how particularly active, but anyway, she is part of the DSA and at least to a certain extent active in it. Which brings us to the first of the last articles in the two last articles in the book, The Millennial Left is Dead, where I wrote that in the aftermath of the big Democratic Socialists of America convention that was held here in Chicago last summer. To talk about, okay, how is it that the Iraq and War on Terror anti-war movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement first was folded into the Bernie Sanders campaign largely, and now is ending up in the Democratic Socialists of America. And again, like my prior exposure to Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the 80s, I was also exposed to the DSA, which was founded in the 1980s by Michael Harrington. And you guys may or may not have heard of Jacobin Magazine. So the founder, editor, publisher of Jacobin Magazine, Oscar Sankara, who was around Platypus a little bit when we were first starting out, he was a member of the DSA. And at that time, I thought, oh, how is it that boxcars are members of DSA? That's a little bit of an exotic fossil type organization, this remnant from the 1980s that seems like very unlikely, because he's talking to me about Lenin and revolution and Marxism, which is not what I thought the DSA was really very much about. So the fact that they ended up in the DSA after the election, in other words, the DSA has experienced a huge spike of growth after the election of Trump, became significant. In other words, it became a way of reanimating actually an older Michael Harrington project, not his project in starting the DSA. The older Michael Harrington project was to try to transform the Democratic Party in the 1960s, to take the crisis of the New Deal coalition, the crisis around the Civil Rights Movement and around the Vietnam War, to try to change the Democratic Party, which didn't happen. In the 1980s, when Harrington started the DSA, the idea was to simply be a ginger group within the Democratic Party, to just sort of float ideas and not really try to change, just try to nudge things a little bit, to be kind of a think tank. And a lot of mainstream politicians were indeed members of the Democratic Socialists of America as Democrats. So I mentioned Ed Koch. David Dinkins, who was the mayor after Ed Koch in New York, who had been the Manhattan borough president and then became mayor of New York, he was a member of the DSA. And the woman who replaced him as Manhattan borough president, Ruth Messinger, was also DSA. And they had other elected officials, in actually powerful positions throughout the United States back then in the 80s and early 90s, in a way that, of course, the DSA won't. It won't. Right. So it's a lesser phenomenon. So it was a little bit shocking to me that the millennials ended up in the DSA, this kind of 80s remnant, in the same way that Sanders and Trump were these kind of blast from the past figures from the 80s too. I don't know if you guys know this from Back to the Future. I think Back to the Future 2 had this weird prediction of the Trump presidency where, is it Biff, right? Who's like this, asshole, becomes president, and this is like a horrific kind of idea for people. And so it just seemed like, okay, this is just rounding out in this funny way. It's all resolving in terms that I thought were long behind us back in the 1980s. My explanation for that is simply that we are kind of repeating history in terms of how people reacted to Reagan. That's how they're reacting to Trump. And so coming full circle, I felt like, okay, what does someone my age have to contribute to the present moment? My own experience, my own historical experience, my own experience of history, and living just long enough at this point to see history repeat itself and to try to grasp that in a new way, because of course it's repetition with a difference, but it is a repetition. It is a repetition. Which brings me to the final article in the piece, the appendix, symptomology. I'll just make some mention of that. That was an article that I wrote after the first 100 days of Obama. You guys are familiar with the 100 days idea. It has two historical references. It's from FDR's first 100 days when the New Deal was implemented. It also refers to the 100 Days campaign of Napoleon when he tried to come back into power. And so it has both of those references. So after the first 100 days of Obama, I wrote about the left and what had happened to the left as a result of Obama's election in the symptomology article, and thinking about already at that time the crisis of neoliberalism that was emerging with the economic crisis and what we might prognose out of that. But the real end of the book in terms of articles that I wrote between 2015 and 2017 is the end of the Gilded Age, meaning thinking about how history is repeating itself, not only in terms of the Reagan election in 1980, or maybe a little bit more deeply with the New Left, Nixon in 1968, but going all the way back to the early 20th century, the end of the Gilded Age in the emergence of progressivism in American politics with Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, the transformation of, ultimately, of the Democratic Party, the party that was the conservative party before FDR, but with FDR became the liberal party. So before that, the Republicans were the liberal party and the Democrats were the conservative party. The Democrats were the Dixiecrats. They were the racial conservatives. They were, the South. And it started to flip in the 30s with FDR. FDR, who took inspiration from his uncle-in-law, Theodore Roosevelt, who attempted to transform the Republican Party, but ended up having to split it and started the Progressive Party that was ill-fated and didn't succeed. But in the 1912 election, where Woodrow Wilson beat the dominant party of the time. The dominant party since the Civil War had been the Republican Party, and they were the Liberal Party, and Woodrow Wilson, through his progressivism, came to power mostly because Theodore Roosevelt took too many Republican votes. That's how Wilson won the election. But going all the way back and thinking about, okay, what is the United States, and what's the global order that the United States has ruled for the last 100 years? What are its origins? Its origins in the late 19th and early 20th century, and specifically the kind of politics that we have from the high 20th century. What are the origins of that? What are the origins of Democratic Party progressivism, of New Dealism, the Great Society, the things that Bernie was invoking, in fact. Because Bernie, he's known as a socialist, but he wasn't really running on a socialist platform. He was running on an old-style Democratic Party platform, a kind of pre-neoliberal platform, progressivism. Of the Great Society and of the New Deal, a New Deal, which Obama also promised but didn't deliver, and now Bernie was promising again. And for a brief moment, the New Yorker had an article where they talked about the art of the New Deal. They said maybe Trump's going to give us the New Deal, actually. Yet to be seen. So that was the sort of gist of the last 2 years, how we've been trying to process things in Platypus, both internally and among our members, the kind of discussions we were having, which I've tried to give expression to in the articles that I wrote for Platypus, but also in our public events and in the curation of other writers, other thinkers on the left, in the Platypus Review that we wanted to collect and have as a kind of an intervention, have a book. It's the second book that we've published. The first book is a collection of articles from the first 7 years of Platypus. It's this monster, the Platypus Review Reader, that has several thematic chapters on different topics. And so the idea was, okay, well, what if we had a book that was just on one topic, one theme, and that was making more of a kind of intervention rather than a retrospective view, but an intervention in the moment. And because we're still processing the election, we're still processing the Trump phenomenon, I think, and the problems on the left for doing so are still there as impediments, and so it still need to be addressed, still need to be specified, still be identified.